really a lot of folks, when they see our bikes, they recognize the sort of 1920s, early 30s look. I'm a designer, pure and simple, and a wannabe philosopher, I guess.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Buffalo, New York, Pompano Beach, Florida, Westminster, Colorado, Quito, Ecuador, Nairobi, Kenya, and Flensburg, Germany. It's always cool to see how far this little show can reach across the globe. And this episode marks the third anniversary of the podcast, and it's been incredibly rewarding for me to share so many great stories and guests with you, and the time has flown by. But as it's grown, I'm proud to say that Horsepower Heritage has earned a very loyal audience, and I'm grateful to each and every one of you who take the time to listen and share the show. And if you've only just discovered the show, I should mention that there are hours and hours of great stuff for you here, and I try to make each episode as evergreen as possible. So if you go back and listen to an episode from a year or two ago, it'll still be fresh. It won't feel dated. But as we move ahead, I want to let you know I'm working on something else, the Horsepower Heritage newsletter. It's going to be an occasional thing, at least once a month, and it'll cover events and news items and interesting tidbits that I think you'll enjoy. So I'll be launching the newsletter soon, and if you would like to receive it, here's what you do. Go to horsepowerheritage.com and click on the contact button, and then send me a request to join, and I'll add you to the list. And that's all there is to it. I won't share your address with third parties, so you won't be getting any spam. I don't like that either. It's just going to be good stuff for car people, and it's kind of a way to build a community here. So sign up. Again, go to the homepage at horsepowerheritage.com, click on the contact button, and just say, send me the newsletter or whatever, and you'll be good to go. One more thing before we get started. If you're listening on a podcast platform called Stitcher, you may have heard that it's going away. And after August 29th, they won't be updating the app, which means that you're going to have to find a new place to listen because new episodes will not be appearing there. There are a ton of other options, of course. There's Apple Podcasts and there's Spotify, but also Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, and also there's an embedded player on my website at horsepowerheritage.com. So lots of choices for you, lots of ways to listen. So check one of those out and stick with the show. Don't miss any episodes. All right, well, let's talk about today's episode. If you've ever wanted a classic motorcycle, but maybe you don't want to deal with the problems that come along with one of those, namely things like reliability or finding parts, and you just want to have a fun ride with some vintage style, then I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. My guest is Richard Worsham, and he's the founder of Janus Motorcycles. And they build a line of sharp-looking bikes in northern Indiana. And it's all about fun cruising, or rambling, as Richard likes to say. So whether you're a veteran rider or you're thinking about trying two wheels for the first time, you'll probably get some inspiration from this story. It's always fun for me to talk to founders because they take chances and they believe in their vision, and inevitably I learn good stuff from these conversations. And I think you will too. Don't forget to follow the podcast, leave me 5 stars and a quick review, and share the show with your friends. And get ready to ramble along with Richard Worsham of Janus Motorcycles. And that's coming up right after this. This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. No matter what's in your garage, you can fit all your automotive heroes on a shelf. And they've got you covered, whether it's 1/43rd scale, 1/18th scale, or even the ginormous 1/8 scale masterpieces from the Amalgam Collection. Go to modelcitizendiecast.com and get 10% off when you use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Richard Worsham, Janus Motorcycles, terrific little bikes, and I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much, Maurice. Been a big fan of this podcast, and I'm really excited to be your guest.
Richard, you've got this ethos you call rambling. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the word rambling, we were trying to think of a way of describing this new category of motorcycles that we're creating. And rather than talk about them being lightweight or them being small displacement or slow or whatever, we're thinking, what is the activity that we actually are trying to hone in on that all motorcyclists can understand? And the word for me kind of sprung into my head was rambling, which, it has all these connotations today of somebody who's rambling in their conversation. They don't know what they're talking about and they just babble on, or maybe walking around not knowing where you're going. But originally the word means like to walk or to move about for leisure, because it's a choice you make that you don't have to be going somewhere. And that to me really gets at the heart of our idea of it's the getting, not the there. And it's the journey and it's the people you meet and the experiences you have, even the experiences of getting a flat tire or getting caught in the rain, or I use the example of climbing rows or a clematis when it's climbing a wall. It's rambling and it doesn't really need to be getting somewhere on time. And so that's the activity that we're trying to get at. And we're not alone in that. I think the best vehicles provide an opportunity to ramble.
That's great. There's a lot to a name, and I suspect, Richard, that you are a fan of Roman and Greek mythology. Am I right?
Yes, I am. Absolutely. And I spent a lot of time in Rome. So Janus, of course, is the name of the company. And Janus is a unique god because he's not a super well-known one. He's not in the Greek Parthenon, just a Roman god, but he has this, he's represented as having two faces, one looking to the past and one looks to the future. The temple of Janus in Rome, they would keep the doors open in time of war and closed in time of peace. We get the month January is the beginning and end of the year. So it's also, because of that, it's the god of the road, beginnings and ends. So we thought it was really fitting for us as a company that is very aware of the history of vehicles and looks to the past for inspiration and the future. We have disc brakes and fuel injection, and we try and create a modern vehicle. This kind of mythical god would be our emblem.
So I'm a motorcyclist. I have a 73 BMW R75/5, and that's kind of my pride and joy. And so nothing super high performance, but that's what's great about your bikes is they are all about fun, right?
You got it.
Yeah. And so I can't remember when I first saw a Janus motorcycle, but I did a double take because it looks like a bike inspired by the early motorcycles, the 1910s and 20s motorcycles. And I don't think there's anyone else doing what you're doing.
I think the closest thing to what we're doing would be like Royal Enfield, which is actually like they just never stopped.
Right.
Of course, continuing to make these British style bikes in India. But yeah, you're right. Like what we're doing, there's really no one else building. I mean, the Enfields would probably, if 1950s would be what they're continuing. And really a lot of folks, when they see our bikes, they're, they recognize the sort of 1920s, early 30s look. Definitely when I was designing them, looking at bikes like the Brough Superior, the Zenith, especially from that period of like late 20s, early 30s. And it's an interesting thing because honestly, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. The question of, because we get labeled retro a lot, and I've always been like, I don't know what I think about that. Like, are we making these things just so that they look like it's a throwback to this kind of golden era of, Bentley 4.5s and, is that what we're trying to do? Or are we trying to make something that's new and valuable in its own right? And it's come into my mind. I mean, and it's been there all along, but being able to describe it is that those vehicles, and you can say the same thing about like timepieces, like watches, especially certainly mechanical watches, that today your smartwatch does everything and 50 million more things than your mechanical, Rolex or whatever it is does. And yet it cannot compete with the experience. And that's why there's a level of impracticality to these vehicles from that time period where it was a choice you made, and it had panache and it had style. And it was like when you're driving, I mean, you can say this about expensive things like Brough Superiors or Bentleys or Vincent Bugatti Type 35 or whatever. You can say these things about these things, but you could say the same thing about my first car, which was a Volkswagen Bug, the 1972 Bug. Which when I was driving that thing to school, I would drive from Virginia up to New England to college, and you're going across the George Washington Bridge in New York. The stick shift is vibrating, as they always do, and you're doing like 72 miles an hour. The windscreen's about 8 inches from your face, and you feel like you're flying a biplane.
Yeah.
It's just like,
that's a great comparison.
Wah! And you're looking at that generator light, making sure the belt didn't break, because that happens. You're just going along, and it's like this experience that you're going 70 miles an hour, and yet you feel like you're flying. And if you talk to one of our owners, that's why they're doing it. They're there to experience this sensation of riding. The same thing is true. I'm a sailor, and I love wooden boats. And I was listening to this conversation about some old guys that knew this famous designer, L. Francis Hershoff. Hershoff name is a real big in New England boat building. And they were talking about what he was trying to do. And it was a quote he had was, the best boats, it's not the technical specifications, it's the boat that gives you the sensation of sailing.
Right.
And I've never heard a way of describing that's any better than that. So what we try and do here is create vehicles, motorcycles that provide the most distilled, visceral, sometimes even uncomfortable experience of sensation of motorcycling.
It's probably cliche at this point. I'm not the first one to describe it this way, but what we're talking about is the difference between an analog experience and a digital experience, or sort of an automated experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of things to do on an older motorcycle.
Yes. Or
maybe it's better stated, there's a lot less to do on a newer motorcycle. And it sort of takes you out of the realm of experience, and it's a more passive experience, if that makes sense. That's how I see it.
Absolutely. The way in thinking about this lately, especially, I like to think of it as in the terms of like being a passenger. So if you're driving your 72 Bug or your Vincent Black Shadow or your Bentley or whatever, your Alfa Romeo, you're a pilot. The opposite of that is you're a passenger. And so if you have the extreme example would be an autonomously driving car, where the expectation as a passenger is comfort and punctuality. That's the highest it can ever achieve. Whereas if you're driving a car that, like a manual transmission, there's all kinds of things that can happen to you. Some of them very dangerous. Sure. And thrilling.
Well, and, so many people with an older car don't listen to the radio. They may not even have a radio in the car, and they don't miss it. And motorcycling is the same way. Occasionally I'll be on my earbuds listening to music, but most of the time I'm not. I'm checked out of all of that, and I just want to be on the bike, with the bike, of the bike. Kind of getting a little zen here, but
no, it's not zen. It is zen. It's the zone, and the zone is like,
right.
They talk about it. It has to be in the zone. You have to be challenged enough that you're fully engaged, but it can't be too hard or dangerous that you're terrified. And there's this like little pathway between those two, which is called the flow state. And
totally,
that's where you get on a motorcycle. And so when you hear like old Harley guys or crotch rocket guys or anybody talking about, I just feel like the freedom of the road, I like the wind in my face. That's what they're talking about.
Yeah. Flow is a real thing. It is a phenomenon. It's
100%.
Metaphysical.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, you mentioned earlier that sometimes your bikes are uncomfortable. And I'd say that's probably a great word to use, because your bikes are hardtails, right?
One of the models is, and my marketing department's going to get mad if I say uncomfortable, but there's a grain of truth there that we do not design these bikes to be armchairs. It's not a Goldwing, and there's 100% a place for Goldwing or a Chieftain or whatever. There's all these different kinds of motorcycles out there. But what we're trying to do is make
Electra
a bike
Glide, whatever.
Yeah, whatever big comfortable bike you have. But if you're trying to distill and augment the sensation, it calls for a very specific tool. And that tool is a minimalist tool. Like our instrumentation, especially on the 250, it's one gauge. It's about that big, and it's a speedometer. And then of course we're required by law to have an odometer on there. I mean, it tells you if your turn indicator's on or whatever, but like, just like your Bug, it's got one light, your Beetle, which one's on? I don't know. They're blinking. But yes, the 250 Halcyon is a hardtail. It's what you brought up. And I don't know what we were thinking when we launched that bike. The first model that we thought we were going to come out with was a cafe racer. We founded Janus in 2011. And that was kind of like at the crescendo, maybe right before the end of the cafe racer craze. And if we had done any market research, it would have been, we do a cafe racer. And that's what we thought we were going to do. But somehow I got distracted by, I don't know if you're familiar with Ian Barry, Falcon Motorcycles. He was out in California. If you're not, look up his bikes. They're inspirational. It was that point in the custom motorcycle scene when things really changed, like Bike Exif had come out. I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Dorleon, the Vintagent.
Oh yeah, he's been on the show. Paul's a great guy.
Yeah, well, his blog back when he had just a simple blog was super inspirational for me in the history and all that stuff. And then Ian Barry, his bikes, it was like when I thought custom motorcycles, I thought like, choppers, and which are great. It's just not my cup of tea, so to speak. But then I started seeing like Bike Exif and the kind of alt custom scene and Ian Barry's bikes. And I got really interested in, I've always been a lover of, as you can imagine, like 20s and 30s vehicles. And he was trying to kind of like do this thing with Vincents and Triumphs and stuff like that. And so I got sidetracked by this Halcyon concept, and it turned into a hardtail. And lo and behold, that bike, that model, we started with a 50cc two-stroke. Then we went to a 250. And now we just 2 years ago launched a 450 version, all the same Halcyon DNA. It's the same design aesthetic. And the 450 now has full suspension, kind of a Vincent style paired shocks under the seat suspension. But yeah, it was a strange, no market research, just a passion. So yeah.
Well, let's back up. How did you decide to start a motorcycle company in the first place? It had to be just driven by passion initially.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was, I mean, I say this and it sounds kind of cliched or something, but as a kid, I drew cars like crazy, like sketchbooks of, like I had my own kind of like coach building house. I turned my middle name into an Italian name, and it was Scuderia Gardini, and was designing these things. And I thought it was just so cool. And I had my logo and everything. So eventually I didn't get into bikes until maybe like college. I thought they were dangerous. I was much more interested in coach work. But anyway, yeah, I had this idea of I've always wanted to do it totally as a passion kind of thing, not as I have no entrepreneurial education whatsoever, no MBA. But in 2007, I graduated from college with a literature degree, and then went to Notre Dame, which is of
course, Fighting Irish.
You got it. Has a really awesome and very, very unique architecture program that has classical and traditional architecture. And kind of keeping in mind my interest in history and this kind of reviving of tradition, that appealed to me. I graduated, and 3 months later founded a motorcycle company. And there was no real research or business acumen that went into that. It was totally a whim and a passion driven decision that for the first couple of years was fueled by that. We would build one bike that would pay for the next one. We didn't pay ourselves. And until about 2014 or 15, when we said, if we're going to keep doing this, we got to grow up a little bit and get EPA certification and CARB so that we can actually sell these things in volume. And that's what we did.
So you're still in Indiana. You're in Goshen, Indiana, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Give us a flavor of Goshen, Indiana, because, this whole area of the Midwest at one time was like this industrial powerhouse.
That's right. Notre Dame is in South Bend, and the main industry there was Studebaker, which I think it went, what was it, 63, went out of business, maybe a little bit later. But there was a huge automotive industry, and we're still, a lot of the manufacturing in this area is like second tier suppliers to Ford, to Detroit automotive manufacturers. But since the 60s, really since the 70s, I think, we have become Elkhart County, the county that Goshen is the county seat of, has become the home of RV manufacturing. So recreational vehicles, 80% of RVs are manufactured in Elkhart County, and they're shipped all over the country. And that, combined with the automotive background, the manufacturing, we're in the Rust Belt here in northern Indiana, means that you just have this incredible network of potential suppliers that you can do anything. And the RV industry especially is really, how do I describe it? It's kind of the Wild West. There's all kinds of stuff happening. There's just all these really small manufacturers that are supplying bigger ones all over the county. So you can't really drive. I say this a lot, but it's really true. You can't go a mile without passing a machine shop or a powder coater or a laser cutter or some little shop on the side of the road, pole barn that's supplying the RV industry or some other aspect of this manufacturing economy. And that, combined with, we also have a very large Amish community, which, believe it or not, makes up most of our manufacturing partners. So we have,
really,
yeah, that just is it just happened that way. My business partner, the guy who I founded Janus with, we were into vintage mopeds. That's what got us into this, pedal type, dorky little 60s and 70s mopeds. Puch, Gorelli, what are the ones that you'd recognize? Motobacane, all these, Badavas, all these European, they basically, the oil crisis of the mid 70s, hundreds of thousands of these came over to the States. And there was a whole culture around that when we started Janus. We were big into that, hotting them up and going to rallies in California and ripping them around at 65 miles an hour.
Two strokes are so much fun. Just winding them up. I love it.
And there's so much you can do to one.
They're just...
Yeah, we got into, basically, the main product we were making was expansion chambers, hand hammering the cones to make these, we had one expansion chamber, was a 19 cone multi-stage, and that thing you could quadruple the power of a little 50cc, that and a better car. Anyway, through that, we found some Amish shops that were willing to work with these two young guys that looked like we probably looked like we were idiots that wanted to build a motorcycle chassis. And they kind of let us set up shop in the back of their fabrication shop. And we would basically build the prototypes and then hand them off and then help them make the tooling. And then they would manufacture it for us. And gradually that very rudimentary little setup got bigger, kind of snowballed to the point where we would just hand them designs and formal prints, and they would manufacture them for us. And they still make a lot of parts for us. When we launched the 450, our end goal is to bring a lot of this stuff in-house. But when we launched the 450, we brought the 450 chassis and all of our fenders in-house. Fabricating that, we opened a second facility. Yeah, it's really just this area, this Goshen and the surrounding county, that allows us to do what we do. It would not be possible anywhere else.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to mention that, because you're in the right place, even if maybe it wasn't the right time to start a motorcycle company.
And even if we didn't know we were in the right place.
Right. Well, like you said, you were two idiots, right? And sometimes it's easier to get into something in total ignorance than it is to do your research and scare yourself out of doing it.
Absolutely. It's really true.
By the way, I always thought that the Amish didn't use electricity or any kind of...
Yeah, so it depends. It's very local on what their regulations, or whatever you want to call it, their strictures are. Typically, at least in this area, they can use electricity for professional, in their business, but it's not on the grid. So all the power, all these, they use a lot of World War II era brake presses and equipment that make our bikes, and even the welders and stuff. It's all run off a diesel generator.
Wow. It's interesting.
And it's not an intentional, we're not we're off the grid, it's just no, it's just, that's what makes the most sense for us. Now, when we make ours, obviously we're totally hooked into the grid and using modern welding. But that's just a kind of weird artifact of how we do things.
Now, so are they still part of the business, a part of the supply chain?
Very much so. So it's not just so we work with one fabrication shop primarily that does all of our 250 chassis, all the fuel tanks for all model lines. So all of our aluminum, we have aluminum fuel tanks, air boxes. Those are the
fenders.
Fenders are steel, and we brought that in house 2 years ago, which is another story how we do that. Really incredible. We have a good video on it. But yeah, the Amish shop.
Yeah, I saw it. It's pretty cool.
The Amish shop does all of our aluminum and then all the 250 chassis, some 450 brackets, and just random stuff that we haven't brought in house yet. But our goal eventually is to start, as we are able, bringing that in house. It's very, very, very time consuming and labor intensive to make even a single part, just to tool up for that. So we're getting better at it. We're getting faster at designing the tooling, but we're excited about it. The fenders, though, we used to have them made up in Elkhart, which is the next city up from us, by a roll forming place, and they used to make the Continental wheel covers for the Continental.
Oh, you mean like a Continental kit for like
the Continental kit? Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah,
right.
Basically, it's like a bunch of rollers, and it rolls through and shapes the fender. We really didn't have a whole lot of luck with getting them being able to hold the tolerance that we needed. And so we started looking into having them made ourselves. And we contacted a guy on the West Coast, Joe Cooper, leading custom fender maker. He does a lot of fenders for choppers and you name it. And we basically contracted with him to use his technology to make our own. And we imported this machine called a Pullmax, which if you're into bodywork, you know what the Pullmax is. And we found one in Gothenburg, Sweden, which is where they're made from the 60s. And it was cheaper for us to just import it. So we imported it, and we now make all our own fenders in-house, and they're absolutely gorgeous works of art. When they come off that machine, it was a combination of that and a planishing hammer. When they come off that machine, it's ready for paint. That's how smooth it is. It's just absolutely stunning. And it really took our bikes to the next level.
I've watched the video on your website, and people can go to janusmotorcycles.com and check out the fenders and all of that. But I really like the hand built factor in your products. And I know it's not the cheapest way to do it, but you're also not trying to build 10,000 bikes a year.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question because we're really up against the whole power sports industry for the last 30 years. And it's funny we're on this, on your podcast, Horsepower Heritage, because, horsepower is a big deal to us, but we go for the opposite route. We go for really few horsepowers, as we call them.
Well, actually, I would say, Richard, that just about everything about your bikes is sort of counterintuitive. And that's what makes it interesting. And that's what makes it stand out in the market.
You've got it. So basically our 250 line, we chose a motor that is, it's basically the motor that powers the third world developing countries. It's the most bulletproof little, if I had my druthers to tour the world, I'd take that because I know exactly how to fix it without even taking it out of the frame of the bike. It's that easy. Just super simple. Developed by Honda in the 70s to be low maintenance for these places where they weren't getting enough maintenance to run properly.
And you're talking about places in the world where two wheels is the default transportation for most of the population.
Yeah, we're talking about bikes that, like here in the States, you can look at guys that commute to work and they'll tell you, oh, I use this as a practical means of transportation. Yeah, but you're not forced to. It's a choice that you make to ride a bike. And that's true. I'll stick behind that here in the States, we ride motorcycles as a choice, and thank goodness we can. It's a beautiful thing, and we get to experience this amazing sensation of riding that we call here at Janus. We call it rambling because it's just you get to just experience the road. But some places they don't, and so this motor is designed to basically be like you wake up in the morning and it has to work every day in, day out. And so what our goal was we don't have dealers. We're direct to consumer. We want to make sure that we have an engine that is going to be low maintenance. And the other part of our whole experience, the sensation of piloting is being able to work on the bike yourself. And so rather than like many manufacturers actively discouraging customers or owners from working on their bike, we actually encourage it. And we offer a 4-year, I think it's the longest motorcycle warranty in the industry on our 250 line. And we encourage people to work on it themselves. And it's not backfiring on us. We launched the 4-year plan, a 4-year warranty last year after realizing these motors are bulletproof. So we really want to encourage folks. We have a YouTube channel. I mean, it sounds crazy, but our YouTube channel is our service department. And it's our dealer as well. And we have videos that, anybody can do their own valve adjustment, oil change, and you can do it in like 45 minutes if you're slow. If you're fast, you can do it in 10 minutes. And you can pause the video if you lose your place or whatever. And then of course we also will, if you don't want to do it, we'll find a shop for you to work on it. And it's such a simple motor that anybody with basic tools can do the work themselves.
Well, and your bikes you've got 2 bikes, right? You got the 250 and then you've got the 450, and they're both thumpers. They're single cylinder bikes.
Single cylinder. Yep. So the 250 line, we originally launched that with 3 models. We had the Halcyon, which is our flagship. We've sold over 1,000 of those 250s. We have our Phoenix model, which was the Cafe Racer, which we discontinued last year. And then we had our Griffin 250, which is our kind of scrambler. They're all the same platform. We use a lot of modular components that allow a small company like us to have 3 or 4 models. And they just have different running gear or fuel tank or handlebars or seating so that it accomplishes that task. 2 years ago, we launched our 450 line, which to date is only available in the Halcyon model, our most popular. We sold about 200 of those. And I throw these numbers out like we built 1,000 of these. It doesn't sound like that much in the larger world of automotive manufacturing. But when you think we have a team of about 20 people, that's a lot of bikes. We built last year we did about 300, a little over 300. This year we're shooting to do about 300, but we've added this extra 450 line. So yeah, we have some guys in here that Ryan, our lead senior builder, he's built over 1,000 motorcycles. And when we say build, we don't have an assembly line. It's a stand. He puts a bare frame on it, puts the engine in, and he builds the bike. It's pretty amazing.
And every bike is built to order, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, we occasionally, if we have time, we'll put, we call them an inventory bike. And it's just, we build it a spec bike that we think people will like. We put it on the site and they usually sell within, days, if not hours. But all of our bikes, and it's kind of what we built the company around, is the idea that you can spec out this bike. And it's pretty likely that it's the only one like it because we have so many options. When you add up all the different things you can do, there's thousands of possible configurations, pinstriping, color. We offer, I don't even know how many colors there are anymore. There's probably a dozen different colors you can primary color, and the pinstriping options are infinite. And then you can do a second pinstripe color. You can have things engraved, leather colors, what kind of options and upgrades you want. So yeah, that's kind of what we build it around. And as the bike's being built, we take photographs of it, put together a Google album for the customer. So as it's being built, they can actually like in real time see those photographs. It's kind of like a baby album, I guess. People love it. And I think that people appreciate the weight. If you order a Janus, you don't get it, you don't drive it home. You wait weeks, if not months for it. And when it arrives, it's pretty special.
Yeah. So you've got the 250 Griffin, which is kind of a little scrambler, right? And then you've got the 250 Halcyon and then the 450 Halcyon, right?
That's right. Yep. And the Griffin, we don't sell as many of those. The 250, honestly, it's weird, but that hardtail 250 Halcyon is our top seller. And it's wild. That's why I kind of mentioned that it's not about practicality. It's not about efficiency. We say it's the part between A and B that it's the getting, not the there. That's what Januses are all about. And it also what it has going for it is that most of your old bicycles don't have rear suspension, and it's one thing if you're riding a 600-pound Harley Davidson hardtail, and when you hit a pothole, that 600-pound bike punches you in the thorax,
right, or other places.
Or other places, exactly. But if you're on a 260-pound Halcyon with a really nice sprung seat, nice front suspension. It's not the end of the world. And I mean, I've done some crazy things on the 250. I've ridden cross country in 6 days. And then I've done there's an organization called the Iron Butt Association, and they do the entry level ride is 1,000 miles in 24 hours. And I've done a couple of those on the 250 with literally in some cases minutes to spare.
Wow.
But just to prove the fact that you can do it. We've had owners that have ridden to Dead Horse and back on the 250 Halcyon. It's about having fun and having an adventure. And when you roll up to a show or a bar or something on one of these bikes, there's nothing else like it. And you can park next to a couple of $60,000 Harley Davidsons and steal all the thunder on your little, $9,000 250.
And you've got a 5-speed gearbox, right? So you got some longer legs for the bikes. They're not just for cruising around town.
Yeah. So the 250, they're all both 5-speed, classic Honda, technology. The 250 will do top speed is 70. So I rode it on the Interstate 80 all the way across the country. I obviously wasn't passing many people, but you can do it. Our goal with the 450 though was to create a bike that still had the lightweight, still had that visceral, sensation of riding, of rambling, but that could get on the interstate and you could pass somebody if you needed to. So that one's top speed is about 90 miles an hour. It's happiest, of course, loping along at 65, which is where most motorcyclists are happy, loping along on 2-lane roads. And so our whole thing is basically like, what do you do on a bike? Do you want to get on the interstate? Maybe if you have a big BMW and you want to get to Denver or something, but for the most part, when I get on a bike, I want to go on as twisty and scenic a road as I can and enjoy the journey.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of want to jump on at a moment's notice. Hey, I think I'll take a ride today and not have to worry about strong arming this huge touring bike out of the corner of the garage where you keep it because your garage is full of all other sorts of stuff, right? That's how my garage is.
Yep.
I just want to be able to zip out of the bat cave and take a quick ride and no muss, no fuss. Absolutely.
That's a common story with a lot of our owners. We have young owners that are getting into biking and they don't want something that's super intimidating. We have older owners that maybe their Harley, they just aren't as comfortable in it anymore. And we have other guys that they have a whole fleet of bikes and they want something different that does a different job. That's honestly probably our typical customer has more than one motorcycle and they ride they want a different tool in the toolbox, I guess.
That doesn't surprise me at all. And after all, most motorcycles are fairly specialized. Whether you're talking about a scrambler or a touring bike, or there are very few motorcycles that do it all.
Yeah, I've got one of my favorite, this is going to be horrifying, but one of my favorite bikes was a Kawasaki KLR 650, which if you're familiar with it, it's like the ugliest old dual sport from the 80s. And it's like, it does everything kind of like not very well, but it'll do everything. And that's a joke. Like, that's what you end up with is it's very practical. I love it. And a lot of the engineering that we've taken in our Janus is based on the KLR, honestly. But yeah, there's a different kinds of bikes for different kinds of things. And we're trying to, the activity I mentioned it before, but like rambling is like this category we're trying to create. And we're, like we talked about a minute ago, it is countercultural to do that. It seems to me, and it seems to a lot of the journalists I've spoken to over the years, that by the late 90s, I guess, the motorcycle industry had reached this point where, like, it was a war of specifications, and the specs were like even the journalists couldn't tell the difference, because you're talking like an extra 5 horsepower, an extra 4 miles an hour, and we're talking. And this is at like 180 miles an hour, 160 horsepower. You can't tell that. Maybe Eddie Lawson or somebody can tell the difference, but it's not in the realm of everyday riding. And so I think there's a need out there for us to kind of like say, okay, that's great. The Kawasaki H2 is cool. I've ridden one. But for there's a different experience that we want to get back to. And it's not just so that we can dress up and cosplay like we're in the 1920s or 30s. Certainly.
Right. No, it's a very real experience.
Yeah. There's a beautiful machines from that era. And I honestly say, like, are you familiar with the original Suzuki Katana? in the
Yeah,
82.
a little bit.
So like
Yeah.
Hans Muth, he also designed a couple of other really stunning bikes for other manufacturers. And I just think that like the Katana, the original Katana, was like a potential springboard for what power, like sports bikes, where they could have gone and they didn't. And then you ended up with the Katana of today, which is just like, in my opinion, hideous, covered in plastic. I don't know. It's just really, really boring. And so I think that like that to me is like the point, early 80s maybe, where things could have gone different directions. And they just chose to go with this war of specifications, of diminishing returns, really. That's not to say there weren't plenty of awesome motorcycles there, but in general, even in the cars too, like I love the Matthew Crawford is a great writer. He wrote Why We Drive, is one of his recent books, and Shop Class is Soulcraft. And he talks about this experience of riding and of how cars and driving, as much as it causes pollution and all this stuff that I completely agree with, there's a real activity and experience and sensation, especially with a manual transmission, and of the culture, the people you meet, the friends you make, and the places you visit that are, if there's a good thing about cars and motorcycles, that's what it is. It's not going a million miles an hour on the public highway.
Yeah, no, it's definitely about the relationships, and not just your relationship to the machine, but the relationships that form because of the machine. It's a great icebreaker.
Yeah, you go up to a gas station and like, you start a conversation, which you'd never have unless you were driving that old Chevy or that, cool bike.
Yeah. Hans Muth designed the BMW R100 RS, which is a brilliant motorcycle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is
very cool bikes. And I love BMWs. That period in the 80s that you were talking about, that was really the result of the revolution in the 70s with the universal Japanese motorcycle and the complacency of the British manufacturers who hadn't really innovated and changed their bikes really since the 40s.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that like the demise of the British industry and how it was taken over by the big four Japanese manufacturers, and the effect that had on the motorcycle design. By the 1980s, it had really they had cemented themselves as the leading thing. Well, I mean, the English were out by the early 70s.
Yeah, so like a good example would be Velocet, a British bike that was handcrafted, fantastic machine, but by the early 70s, they cost way too much. They were expensive to build. The other thing about Great Britain at the time is the 70s were like labor disputes and social strife. Their industry was in decline. The Japanese were hungry, growing, and they had nowhere to go but up. And they just had a completely different philosophy on everything from engineering to labor. So,
by the time that CB 750 came out, it just like killed everything else. But I think you're really onto something there that I hadn't thought about, like the UJM, the Universal Japanese Motorcycle, that this kind of idea of something that not only on a technical level just walloped the English, the Triumphs and Nortons of the era, but was very, very practical too. They really are, and it totally transformed the motorcycle industry until by the 80s. Yeah, I think you did. That's interesting. And I'm not blaming the Japanese industry for that, but it's an interesting perspective.
No, and I mean, the Japanese bikes were fantastic. They were reliable, they were affordable, plenty of power, and innovations like, oh my gosh, a fifth gear. Imagine that.
They didn't leak. They had more gears, and the electrical worked.
Yeah, for sure. But I guess the trade-off is that there was sameness in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
And then also manufacturers, I think, became risk averse.
Absolutely.
So that means that things aren't necessarily exciting. They're just marketable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of designed by committee. I think that like that's why I'd like that Hans Muth, that Katana is like, that was pretty far out there, and a lot of people really hated it, and a lot of people still do. It's a really weird looking bike, but it achieved something, and I just wonder, like, Well, there's also the German brands that went out of business around this. I mean, the whole European, Italian brands that went out of business around that era, that they just couldn't. The Italians, I mean, they had all kinds of funky things that were going on. Moto Guzzi would be, to me, today is still like, they're still doing some neat stuff. MV Agusta or something like that. But I guess a lot of them have been refounded too.
Yeah, definitely. Another bike sort of in this same vein that comes to mind is the BMW K1, which was wild.
Yes.
And it was a very polarizing motorcycle at the time. But, I saw a K1 on the freeway here in Southern California not that long ago, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I saw it. He wasn't riding hard, he was just cruising, but to see that motorcycle on the road is amazing. It's like a unicorn.
Well, absolutely. And there's every once in a while, there's bikes like that come up, like Eric Buell. I think of like the stuff that he came out with, the risks that he took. And then of course you see the result of it. I mean, it's been a kind of tragic story repeatedly of how, his companies haven't been able to make it, but just like, that's a cool bike. He's invented so many different new technologies with those coming out.
And he also developed a really loyal customer base, a loyal fan base.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Buell's pretty cool. And also, I just love seeing American-made stuff. I like what you're doing. I realize that the engines are sourced from Asia. But yeah. I also understand that that's a market practicality, and you didn't just like pick an engine out of a catalog. You actually did your research and found a robust, reliable, easy to maintain power plant.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, you can go two ways with it. Some people say like, they try and defend what we're doing, and they say, oh, well, there's nothing else like it. You can't buy anything like that in the States. Well, yeah, that's true. There is no small displacement engine that would, unless we want to put a lawnmower engine in it, which I don't have any interest in. But like, if you like, that's true. But then there's also the aspect of like, they're actually really cool. They serve exactly the function that we're trying to find. Like, we call them bulletproof, these workhorse engines that you just don't have to worry about. Like, I could spend 10 years developing an engine, spending Lord only knows how much money, and it still wouldn't be as reliable because this thing's been in production for 40 years. Parts availability is like insane. They're fantastic. So like, we have to struggle against that. Like, the kind of like made in China thing. There's a lot of reasons that I would love to be able to make that same engine here in the States or maybe in Mexico or something like that. But there's also a lot of reasons why it does make a lot of sense for us. So it's once more, it's like one of these things that we're doing that's very countercultural, and it's not obvious. It's not like the obvious solution. And so we win many friends and many enemies.
Yeah. Well, you can't please everybody. And why would you try? Right. Because
nope.
that's sort of a recipe for,
you got to take risks. And part of taking risks is not being afraid to only appeal to some people. And it's also, it's not being afraid to do something because you like it.
Right.
Which is really, like the Halcyon, like we did it because I thought it was cool looking, and it takes some fortitude to stick behind that sometimes, especially like we had a video come out last week, and this guy, he's like a major YouTube sport bike reviewer and influencer. And he was just kind of like trying to rip us a new one with, weak, low powered, blah, blah, blah. And they're all like, cosplay bikes and stuff like that. I'm like, I think this means we're starting to make a dent in the market if they're getting mad. But the other half of it is you have to just stick to your guns and keep on going.
Yeah. If you're getting criticism, that means you're getting attention.
It does. And the way we think about it is, as long as, negative word of mouth is totally fine. The only negative word of mouth you don't want is if you're like a criminal. Like, that doesn't stick real well. But people like not understanding it or having a visceral gut reaction to it, that's great. That's what I want.
Well, plus customers know they can pretty much pick up the phone and talk to a real human being at Janus.
Yep.
You mentioned the appearance of the Halcyon. I want to just describe for people a little bit in case they're not looking at your website or whatever while they're listening. But the riding position on your bikes is fairly upright. Your bars extend out quite a ways. So it's not like you're hunched over on the bike. It's sort of a neutral position.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, honestly, the closest thing, if folks are familiar with it, would be like a 1940s Indian, kind of an American, I don't mean like forward controls American bike. I mean a very standard motorcycle. You're very comfortable just sitting upright. Your hands are right where you'd want them if you just put them in front of you. You're not leaning forward on your wrists like a sport bike. Our Phoenix, our cafe racer, had optional bars that you could be a little more drop bars, but the typical position is just real comfortable and you sit upright, very much like a traditional kind of American style motorcycle.
Right. Yeah. Indian, even like a Henderson almost.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those old Curtis or Excelsior or any of those old bikes.
Yeah, very cool. And then you've got what I would call a torpedo fuel tank or a Zeppelin tank, that's sort of the first thing you notice, I think, about the bikes is that's an unusual feature in a world of these bulbous tanks.
Yeah. So that was definitely one of the biggest design things we did was coming up with that tank. I like right from the get-go, I wanted a long, low. If you look at those early machines, especially like a Bruff or a Zenith or any number of, even the Triumphs, I mean, all the old brands, Rudge, all these old brands, they were long and low. They had the front and rear wheel were the same size. So like modern bikes, they always go with a 17 and a 21 or a 17 and a 19, or there's a smaller rear wheel for various reasons. But we really wanted those like symmetrical front and rear wheel and a long, low fuel tank. And really looking at Bruff, I couldn't get that Bruff Superior tank out of my head. Or Zenith had some really hot looking tanks. But then when we started making it, a lot of the design of that tank is it's that way because that's what we could do. We don't have the ability to stamp these ourselves, like with a big, press. So what ended up happening was we made a wooden buck for the first one, and we hand hammered the tank. And first one we made it of steel, and then we realized that we do a lot of welding on these tanks to be able to make them out of sheet metal like we do. There's no compound curves. It's only one directional curves because that's what we could do. And we realized there was so much heat going into it, they were warping. So that was one of the reasons we went with aluminum. It was also because they started weighing a lot. So we moved to aluminum, and we got a tank that was kind of what we wanted, long and low, but we were still bowing on the top. And the Amish guy that we work with suggested that we put this V brake on the top of the tank. And we thought, oh, this is great. It looks really cool, and we'll put that in there. And lo and behold, just like, your HVAC ducts, they have those brakes in them. It's there to stiffen it up so that it doesn't bend. We did that. And then we were walking around his shop, and he also makes brush hogs. And there's this big cowling on the front of one of his brush hogs, and it had this V brake in it. And we're like, Leroy, did you get the idea from that brush hog? And he's like, yep. So we can and it's become really like the hallmark of our model line is this beautiful V brake down the top of the tank. But it was really a practical reason that spawned us using that. And then we inherited it from a utilitarian brush hog from an Amish guy.
No, it works. And sometimes happily form follows function, if you know what I mean, or
Absolutely.
Aesthetics follow function. So,
yeah.
By the way, Richard, did you have any of these hands-on skills prior to founding the company?
I've never really been a great mechanic. I love old engines and stuff, and I tinker a lot. But really, no, I did not. I was not a seasoned even rider when we founded Janus. It was really the idea and the design. Like I'm a designer, pure and simple, and a wannabe philosopher, I guess. And so I like to write and I like to design. And this community we have allows me to put these designs on paper or in CAD and write these ideas down and then turn them over to the incredible people that we have. Not only the Amish craftsmen and the suppliers we have around, but the team we've been able to build here at Janus Motorcycles. We have about 20 employees. We're so small. We don't have an HR department. We're terrible about getting back to people who want to work for us. So they basically end up knocking down the door to work here. And we've just managed to accumulate this incredible, I call it like an elite team. I would put them up against anyone. We have guys that they're car tuners. And so when I'm trying to get a bike through EPA, and first of all, I took a carbureted bike through EPA and CARB with the help of a retired Bendix engineer. He worked in South Bend, worked on fuel delivery on fighter jets. He was able to help me do that. And like, how would I have done that if I didn't know this old retired engineer? And then when I get to the 450, which is fuel injected, by the way, we have this car tuner, and he's like, well, this is how the ECU works, and my OB5 sensor, does this. I'm going to help, and absolute expertise. So, and that goes from the pinstriping, which we do in house. Kelly, our pinstriper, used to be a painter, and she does pinstriping. We have a ex Santa Cruz bicycle wheel builder.
Sure.
Does all our wheel truing and building. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And incredible engineers, craftsmen, welders, all of them are artists. So yeah, I can't really claim that I'm making these things myself at all. It's really the idea that we've been able to put into reality with the help of a really awesome team.
Once again, the less you know, maybe when you start, the better off you are.
Yeah, right.
In some cases. Well, I'm glad you mentioned your team, because it's obvious that people work at Janus because they really love what they do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we have this RV industry here in Elkhart County, and it's wonderful. However, it can be pretty rough. It's a roller coaster ride. You can make a lot of money working on the factory line, but it's pretty brutal. And the industry has these incredible swings. Right now, we're in the middle of a pretty big downswing. Nobody's buying RVs right now, or very few people are, and they overbuilt during the pandemic. And a lot of folks just, they've tried that in the past, or they've seen it happen to other people, and they're interested in something that's maybe they don't make as much money. Well, definitely don't make as much money. But we're in an old dry cleaning building we're like in the heart of Goshen. So we're behind the theater, the record store, and the coffee shop, the police station, and the city hall we're like right in the middle. We have skylights, big windows, got cool music playing. People can basically create their own expectations when it comes to, and they take responsibility for what they're doing. So it's a culture, it's a family, and we try and celebrate that and bring that to the owners as well. We have a owners rally every year, and we always love it when people come to the shop. It has kind of become a pilgrimage that people make to visit, either to order their bike or to pick it up. Not everyone does, but many people do. And they get to meet the people that are building their bike or see bikes being built. So we do, when people buy a bike, we say, welcome to the family. Here's the Kool-Aid.
Nice. Coffee shops around the corner if you're thirsty.
Yeah, right.
Hey, the other question I had for you is, do you pay attention to what your bikes are doing on the used market and how they're holding up?
Yeah, we do. And apart from some crazy people that sell them that don't need to for way too little, we've had this one customer, one of our best customers. He has so many of them now. He has like 3 or 4. I'm like, why are you selling that thing for that? You're hurting us. But most of the time, yeah, the value. I guess I would say the one we had the most experience with would be our first model, the 50cc. And it's pretty rare because we only built about 50 of those. But those are going for well over the retail price. And there are lots of ways, like you can control that. We haven't really gotten into the point where we can control the price as much by offering a buyback program. But yeah, we're seeing the values held pretty well on them, and it's encouraging. And it's not surprising because we build them we basically don't use chrome. It's polished stainless or polished aluminum. So everything can be, like the exhausts are stainless steel. So right there, you're not going to get rusted out exhausts. So our background was in restoring these old mopeds. All the common things that we ran into, we try to avoid, especially plating. Well, plating is just obnoxious. Like dealing with that whole process you have to polish it anyway. Just use stainless steel, pay a little more for the material.
No, I love that approach. And when I look at a new motorcycle that's classically styled, and I won't mention any brands, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I am so disappointed when I get close to it and it's plated plastic. It's like,
yeah,
it's just so disappointing.
That's cosplay. That's retro.
Thank you.
That's why I don't like the retro title, because I think that I'm going to mention a brand name and a model because I love them. The Bonneville. I mean, the Triumph Bonneville, I think does a great job of encapsulating the real reason why we love motorcycles. But there are other versions that they're putting on these clothes to imitate this idea or this nostalgia we have for the past. The worst example in the automotive world would be like the PT Cruiser.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a boring car with some that. I mean, it's cool. I like the idea, but it doesn't have the guts to back it up.
Yeah, PT Cruiser, Plymouth Prowler,
HHR,
yeah.
And then there's some successful ones like the Mini Cooper. I think the original Mini Cooper, not the original, the first iteration of the retro one. But then they've forgotten what they're doing. They're making these giant Mini Coopers. Like, you missed the point. The whole reason that those were successful is they were small.
The bean counters got a hold of it, and guess what? Now they've outsold the earlier versions, and so the bean counters turned out to be right. But it doesn't mean it's as cool for sure.
I meant to mention this earlier. But like, you talk about listening to music when you're in your car. Well, what was his name? The founder of the designer of the original Mini Cooper,
Alex Aganis.
Alex Aganis. Alec forbade radios in the car because he thought it took away from the experience. So there's your guy right there. I love that story.
Richard, do you have any plans for higher displacement bikes coming down the road?
Not at present. I don't rule it out. But I really feel like we've got we call it our corner of the playground, our little corner of the world. And it's this idea of our largest model as a 450, which I would say is a middle in the old world would be a middleweight bike. You think about, I often think about all the famous motorcycles from the last 100 years, and most of them were under 650 cc. Norton Manx, there were a few, Brough Superior, of course, was 1,000 cc, and all the American bikes, but many of the famous racing motorcycles, the most iconic bikes that we know, are what today would be called a beginner bike, or even worse, a chick bike. So I think if we were to come out with a larger one, it would need to weigh less than 400 pounds, which would be hard. We've never really been challenged by weight. We have a steel frame. We don't use carbon fiber or anything like that. There's not much there. So yeah, for the time being, we like where we are.
No, that's good. You found your niche, and you can continue to refine that.
Absolutely.
All right. If you want to learn more, it's janusmotorcycles.com. Richard Worsham, thanks for being on the show.
Maurice, thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk to someone who knows more about a subject than you do. So thank you.
You're too kind, buddy. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was really fun. And I want to get my butt on one of these things.
Well, I think we'll be out in the LA area in the next month or two, so maybe we can make something happen.
That'd be terrific, man. Yeah, let's definitely do that. Thanks again, buddy. That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, support the show with a donation. You can visit buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and throw a few bucks in the gas tank. And don't forget to tell your friends about the show, write a review, because all of that stuff helps me reach more gearheads like you. I'll see you back here on Wednesday, August 9th, when we'll be talking about how to keep cool in your classic car. My guest is Rick Love from Vintage Air. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.